Hi, I'm Quentin Schultz, author of the book Communicating with Grace and Virtue. What I'd like to do is to share a few thoughts with you from chapter 8 of the book, which is about using appropriate media. Appropriate media. There's a lot to unpack there, and a lot I think we need to hear in today's world. When I was a graduate student back in the 70s studying communication, one of my colleagues said to me that they were going to do a doctoral dissertation on the fact that eventually everybody would have their own computer. I thought that was the silliest thing. I said, that's never going to happen. Why? Because I thought that computers were simply all about processing data. I didn't think of a computer as a communication device, which of course it became. In fact, right here, I have a cell phone. This is a computer. And it is a means for me to communicate with text, with email, sending photos, doing video, etc. It's amazing. And one way to look at the world in which we live is that it has been developing more and more different ways of communicating, opening up different ways of communicating, different media, different technologies, more and more. And there's a basic historical rule here that I want to share with you, which is so important. And that is that new media forms rarely replace older media forms. The ever-developing expansion of media forms and uses, ever-developing. We could look at this in terms of the opening up of creation. We tend to think about technological progress as new technologies always replacing older technologies. But when you look at communication, you have to say this is much more complicated, historically speaking. It's not just that new ones replace old ones. In fact, take a look at this. Here I have a couple of little devices. All right. I have a pen, red, and I have a pencil, mechanical pencil. Well, you know, writing has been around for a long time. These may be new manifestations, but that basic media form of writing something, whether we're doing it on a keyboard or whether we're chipping it into a rock, whatever, writing is still there as a form. These new technologies come around. It opens up, the opening up of creation, makes it very complicated for us. Because today we have all these different options for communicating, and we have to make decisions about which ones to use in a given situation. Do you remember some years back when email was just really starting to take off? And there were articles in the news about leaders in some organizations who were firing, terminating people in those organizations by sending them an email. Is that appropriate? Is that fitting to do it that way? What about if we're starting to date someone? What's the best medium to do that in? You know, so always we have these decisions to make that can be fairly complicated because of this media expansion. We might say the opening up of creation. Here's a funny little cartoon that's around the internet. You can find this in many places. So first written word on the left, and then movable type. We got Gutenberg there. Then we've got mass publication. This business-looking guy here. Maybe he's an attorney. He's reading book, and then you got email. This is sort of the decline of human communication, supposedly. And then you got Twitter. This little kid, you know, he's got his little device, and he's sending out short number of characters. Tweet, tweet, tweet. The evolution, or by this cartoon, it's like the devolution, the de-evolution, the downward spiral of communication. Well, is that a good way of looking at it? I'm not so sure. What I want to do here is lay out a way of thinking about how do we use the best medium for a given purpose, the best medium. What does it mean to say best medium? Well, is it the most fitting one? Is it a right fit? Let's say you are starting to develop a relationship with someone, and you have the chance to develop that relationship online through video or going to the beach and walking along the beach. Which is more fitting? It's a question. We could talk about it. or what's most appropriate. Is it appropriate to fire someone through email? And what's most appropriate for different purposes? And second, is it effective? Will it be effective as a communication medium or not? So fittingness, appropriateness, and effectiveness. We can use these three criteria to make judgments about which medium we use for given purposes. I put a little note on the bottom here that's kind of interesting. I'm asking, are handwritten notes more powerful today and more appropriate for some purposes today? I'm a big fan of using handwritten notes, and I have cards that I write notes on and send to people. And sometimes we'll put one in the kitchen, or we'll put one at a work spot when I'm out working with people. Handwritten notes, I think, are more powerful now and more effective. And we've lost the fact that they can be really fitting and really appropriate in some situations. And it doesn't even have to be a pre-done card, like you go out and buy a card at a store and then just write something on it. You can just have a blank card and write a note to someone. It's so easy for us to send something with a text message or email that we don't think about cards and handwriting as if it's some old medium that we don't need anymore. But in fact, it's another option for us. Let's use worship technology as an example. I wrote this book, High-Tech Worship ? High-Tech Worship ? And my basic question is, should we fit worship to technology or technology to worship? That's the question I deal with in the book. Now, how I answer it, I'm going to tell you, because it's going to apply to all of our uses of communication media. We first have a communication purpose. In this case, the purpose is worship. What makes for good worship? Healthy worship, right worship. What's good worship all about? And then we can ask the question, which technologies can contribute to worship? Or maybe if we use certain technologies in certain ways, they detract from worship. So it's not a matter of just saying yes or no. It's a matter of that fittingness, that appropriateness, and that effectiveness for worship. And so what I say in the book is very simply, it's going to depend somewhat. Depending on how we do worship in a given tradition, in a given church, with a given congregation, it might fit really well in certain parts of the worship, such as for singing. But to use a screen technology, let's say, throughout worship might not work. It might get in the way. It might be a kind of interference or distraction from worship. So we make these hard decisions. What is the most appropriate use of a media technology in a given purpose? Again, it's not just yes or no, but it's about how we do it in given situations. And that's what's so important. In all of our lives, we implicitly or explicitly make decisions about which technologies to use in given situations. So I'd like to look at some common issues today, make a few remarks about this appropriateness of using different media. One is declining book reading. We know that younger people are spending less time reading books now. Not just textbooks. I mean, textbooks often are hard to read anyway, but even with fiction or trade books, as we call them, the typical book you would see in a bookstore that's not fiction, a trade book. Is this a good thing? Should we be dedicating more time to reading books? Is there something about reading a book that gives more enjoyment to our life, makes life richer, that the skills that are needed, that maybe the traits that are needed, like patience to read through a whole book, that's important? Something to think about. What about declining, in fact, interpersonal skills? Interpersonal, I mean, let's say one-on-one or groups of three when we interact. We know now that in this age of high-tech media, with all of these devices that we can use, many of them tied to a cell phone now, that interpersonal skills are going down. So when you, like I did as a teacher of college, work with young people about going in to do an interview, I would have to do more prep with them about how do you do an interview? What are the social skills that are needed there? How do you ask questions? How do you give answers? How do you tell stories? I mean, this is on a downward trend. And so what do we need to do there? Third, increased public speaking fear. People have always been fearful of public speaking, but it's even getting worse now. So public speaking skills are down. And if you're in a work environment, you know that often the presentations that people make there are just not very good. And group presentations are among the worst. Why is that? What can we do to beef that up? Public speaking is important for all of us to know. When my grandson turned about 4, I started working on public speaking with him. I know that that's going to sound crazy, but I knew the fear was going to be coming along. And so I had him in our living room, standing up on the hearth in front of the fireplace. You know, there is our platform. We're platform speakers. And we would take turns. So we would start out saying, okay, one time, and then we would tell a story. Then the other person would applaud. I wanted to get him used to starting to do public speaking a little bit. And now that he's in online learning in front of that camera, I think it's helping him out to have been doing that already. But should we be teaching public speaking more now, not less, in this high-tech age? What about social media, texting as a kind of obsession? It is out there. People get obsessed, looking at that phone, that device all the time, and texting. And it's amazing. My wife and I were out at a restaurant, and there were, I would say, late high school age people around a table. I think it was 6 of them. They were there for lunch, and the entire time, none of them said anything to anyone else at the table. And the whole time, all of them were looking at their phones and texting. Maybe they were texting with one another. I don't know. But my point is, what's the most appropriate medium for them to use if they're going to go out together and eat, for them to practice something like social skills? It's not texting. Number 5, video gaming as an addiction. We do know in the research that video gaming can become addictive. We also know that video games that involve some social interaction can help develop some social interaction skills. So it's kind of a mixed bag with video gaming. But if video gaming as an addiction starts to knock out other forms of communication, such as speaking and listening in person, or reading books or writing, it's not so good. So the amounts involved here are very important. When our kids were growing up, I remember limiting how much television they could watch because we wanted them to be reading and doing other things. And now this is, of course, at a whole new level. And finally, number 6, weak listening skills. As I said earlier in this series of videos based on my book, listening, I think, is the most important single communication skill to try to master. And yet listening skills are going down, down, down. We are not listening to each other. We are not understanding each other so well, even though we have all of these phenomenal technologies at our disposal. So what is appropriate for us today? Using appropriate media to make judgments about which media to use in given situations, okay? To consider what's most fitting, what's most appropriate, what's most effective, and to balance our use of media technologies, because it's expanding, it's opening up. It's not that we have fewer choices. We're never going back there. We're going to have more and more choices as the kinds of devices and software increase. So it's tough to live in this kind of world and make decisions and to stay with them and to live in a way where others around us realize what's good for them as well as good for us. But we have to do it. I think it's a responsibility to use media appropriately. I hope you'll consider that. Again, I'm Quentin Schultz, author of the book, Communicating with Grace and Virtue. You can find out more about me, sign up for my email at quentinschultz.com. If you've not read the book, there's a lot more in it than what I can present here, and I hope you'll pick up a copy. In any case, thank you for staying with me in this time as I talk about using media appropriately, and I hope in your life you'll have an opportunity to do that with the people around you. Thank you so much.